I'm Tyler Souters in the Energy News Center. The February 1st deadline has now come and gone for countries to affiliate themselves with the Copenhagen Accord. And 55 nations responsible for more than 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gases did indeed meet that deadline. That means these countries have put on record their climate commitments, either economy-wide carbon targets for developed nations or carbon-cutting actions for less developed countries. But with scientists warning that global warming is already happening rapidly, are these commitments enough to make a difference in the near term? Executive Editor Margaret Ryan is here with a closer look. Margaret, a lot of this is conditional. Nonetheless, there are numbers out there.
There are numbers out there, Tyler. The Copenhagen Accord starts with a pledge to keep global warming below 2 degrees centigrade. That's the first time world leaders ever adopted any temperature goal. Now, this week, environmental groups were quick to point out, according to scientists' models, a lot more carbon cutting will be needed to keep that 2-degree pledge. The figures from those models are 25 to 40% cuts from 1990 levels from developed nations and 15 to 30% from projected levels by major developing countries, and all this by 2020. Now, negotiators for the large economies in Copenhagen said cuts like 40% are just not going to happen by then. But how close do the new Accord pledges get? Now, that's difficult to assess because so many of the Accord pledges are conditional and hedged, or have ranges, or depend on what other nations do. The U.S. target of 17% from 2005 is conditioned on the U.S. Congress acting. The European Union says it'll cut 20% from 1990 levels in any case, but go to 30% if all other major economies adopt similar levels of ambition. Those are the words. Russia offered 15 to 25%, while Australia says 5, 15, or 25%, all depending on other countries' ambition. Japan says 25%, but only if all major economies sign up. Ditto New Zealand, which will cut 10 to 20%. Now, China and India say they're taking domestic actions that will cut their carbon intensity per unit of GDP. The U.S. Climate Action Network notes that there's wide variation in the expected GDP growth for both countries, so China's pledge could mean anything from a 15% decrease in carbon to a 204% increase from 1990, and India's pledge, an increase in any case of 87 to 277%. And South Africa says its pledge to cut 34% from expected emissions growth depends not only on other nations providing financing and technology, but also on a new global treaty that includes extension of the Kyoto Protocol. So where does all that leave things?
What we need coming out of the international effort is actions by these key countries. That's the ultimate objective. And coming into Copenhagen, these countries signaled that they would take steps, and this is a reaffirmation of those commitments today and over the weekend. What I think where we head from here into Mexico and beyond is to try to take those individual country commitments and piece them together into an international agreement that moves us collectively forward. What kind of legal form is very much uncertain at this stage.
Okay, so a lot of this looks like what we saw, Margaret, going into Copenhagen to begin with. The countries saying, I'll do this if, when, a lot of conditions here and really no change with this February 1st deadline.
Really, you're correct. Remember in Copenhagen how those 2 weeks, so much was derailed by procedural arguments. They really didn't get to the substance until the leaders met at the 11th hour. And then they got the Copenhagen Accord, which was basically to put all those offers out here in a public forum. And also, I think you're seeing a continuation of kind of an Alphonse and Gaston act. You remember the old comedy routine, you first, my dear Alphonse, oh no, my esteemed Gaston. Everybody is hoping to be Russia in 2004. At that point, the world needed Russia to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, or after 7 years it wasn't going into effect. So Russia got a deal. They got to no cuts required below their 1990 levels, and their 1990 levels were at the height of the Soviet industry. So, and by 2004, much of that industry had collapsed. They were already way below those emission levels, but they were allowed to join Kyoto with no required cut in their carbon and they got EU backing to join the World Trade Organization. So in a way, everybody would like to be in that kind of bargaining position. And, dominating this, I think, all are real fears that cutting carbon will mean economic harm, the same fears we hear in the U.S. Congress.
So either Russia in 2004 or Ben Nelson in the midst of the Senate healthcare negotiations, similar positions. But for all these conditions, Margaret, it seems like no country is necessarily taking a major chance or a major investment in the green economy necessarily.
Well, I think it's because it is a real risk. The technology simply isn't there yet. Of all the developed nations, only Norway offered to go to 40%, and that's quite a small country. Nobody has really figured out what low-carbon, sustainable development really means, what it really looks like. Look at China. They have an urbanizing population. Every time someone moves from the countryside to the city, their energy use goes up 2.5 times. And China is in the position, every 1 to 2 months, they are building a new Boston. This is a huge number, a huge migration of people, huge new energy demands. Renewables can't provide base load, and they're more costly. And you have countries that are very hard pressed, like China, trying to provide for their people. So are they going to look for the quick, cheap hit? You bet they are. The technology development has to come along before countries that are this hard pressed are going to take a chance on it.
Margaret, earlier this week we heard from János Pastor, who is one of the leading climate advisors at the UN, who said, it's nice we have commitments and people came together. However, it's not enough and not soon enough. A real emphasis on the science to keep global warming below that 2 degrees Celsius target.
Yeah. Well, the scenarios, now remember the scenarios are models. They're based on probabilities. The conclusions don't tell you this is going to happen. They say here is the probability that this is going to happen. And the problem really is that global warming doesn't occur on an election cycle. That we're talking about things that happen over 100 years. And you're talking about the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere since industrialization began, basically over the last 200 years. Carbon can stay in the atmosphere for 100 years. I mean, these are just plain scientific facts. Even skeptics don't argue that part. The issue is, what does it mean? And if the predictions are even in the right direction, let's say it takes 100 years instead of 50 years for an ice cap to melt, but if the predictions are even in the right direction, we have a lot of warming ahead of us just because of the carbon that's already up there. And it's the old, if you find yourself in a hole, quit digging theory. That the sooner we can stop putting more carbon up in the atmosphere, the less of a problem we're going to have.
We'll see where this leaves us heading into Mexico City later this year. All right, Executive Editor Margaret Ryan, thank you, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tyler Suiters, and you're watching Clean Skies News.